I think that both of which are kind of really amazing documents and both very useful in their own right.
Actually related to this, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the counter-revolution and organization, where you're talking about the initial confusing, somehow rhizomatic nature of the revolution being leaderless, and your group also being kind of part of this, as opposed to what we're seeing now. Like, will it gain from organization, or is that actually productive for the counter-revolution, the fact that it is unorganized with folks?
Yeah, I think that, the question of organization and kind of political organization is a really big one in some ways. I find it to be really instructive somebody like Asad Bayat, one can kind of look at it in different ways, but I think where he's really smart is attempting not to kind of look at the traditional social movement model and kind of look at other forms of organization. I think, even he kind of might fall into the trap of, this kind of everyday resistance is kind of everything is political, so then what is actually the kind of content of the political? It's something he tries to address, I think, but it's something that still you need a little bit more than just kind of notions of kind of quiet encroachment and sort of defensive mobilization. I think that there has been a lot of organization and a lot of attempts to organize in the past 2 years. In a way that you can see 2011 as the sort of beginning of a sequence that promises future types of organization. Everyone always criticizes the revolution to say that it's leaderless and that people stayed in the square and whatever. But, there were a lot of people who went out and tried to form political parties and this sort of thing, and who tried to form organizations that were kind of vertical and horizontal and traditional and non-traditional. Most of the successes or the most successful stories of organization have been topic-based, have been kind of instrumental deployments. No to military trials being one of them, Kazibun being another one, sort of an organization that came up that showed an incredible level of kind of complexity and deployment, and then actually sort of ran its course. And when it had effectively achieved its goal, sort of took a backseat, and then has come back and has kind of faded again. It's sort of ad hoc kind of forms. But we're also, I think people are trying to build the kind of durable sort of types of political organization that we ultimately do need. It's, one wants to sort of avoid the trap of, hierarchy, or a rigid hierarchy, let's say, a command control model, and of, inflexible organizations. But, at the same time, you do need to be able to work together, to find one another, and to have networks in place that one can rely on before one needs them most urgent. So I think all of this has happened. I think that we have been in a society which has attacked any form of organization for decades. That has criminalized it, that has penalized it, that has really, really targeted any form of organization. When you look at, and this is something that Mosireen has dealt with, questions of registering as a company, as an NGO, as whatever, every single one, regardless of what you pick, you effectively cannot organize outside of the direct oversight and supervision of the state, without basically submitting yourself to such a level of surveillance that it is effectively whatever you are doing. You could be running a library, and
student society.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a legacy that one has to deal with, and it is a legacy, I think, that that continues to perpetuate itself in some ways. I think that the way that the state stepped in on the 3rd of July last year was, to my mind, a very deliberate kind of attempt to demobilize. I think for all of the problems under the Morsi year, I had the sense that we were beginning to see sort of the beginnings of more durable forms of political organization. A a lot of that energy dissipated when the army stepped in because, it kind of in the tradition of the client state, like we'll take care of it, And I don't necessarily blame people for using those methods and using that state. I think that people are able in many ways to gain ground through the mechanisms of the client state. But at the same time, I think that we need more than that. We need much more than that. And that's something that I think is going to happen, is happening, and also just has to happen. It's something that we have to focus energies on.
Well, first I want to thank you for at least giving me a kind of talk that sort of is based in a hope that I haven't felt in several months. So I think I have a question about the state, but I want to contextualize this within the different forms of hard and soft violence that we are now subject to. So just driving to AUC, other than the violence that itself entails, but the posters, right? سيادة المواطن كمل مشوارك كمل جمالك, all of this stuff, right, with Dear Leader. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of address the soft and hard violence, the state, and memory, because right, it's not just the clientelist, right, structure. The state has functioned as the keeper of memory and the hider of memory. So for historians of the modern Middle East, there's a real reason why nobody studies anything after the 1950s, because we can't access the archives. There's no there are archives, but we can't access them. Just before the revolution, I went to the Abidin Museum, and it was insane. It was like the monarchy Mubarak. There was nothing in between, right? And I teach history at AUC, and I teach 1973. And no, the way that the state sort of teaches us and forms memory is something that we struggle with, and it has really broad legacy. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of that soft violence and how you guys as a collective are confronting it or thinking about it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because, again, this is kind of a different periodicity that you're framing. I think that we have one strong advantage in that the educational system is so desultory that the past in some ways just doesn't, that we are freed of the burden of the past because we have not learned it.
Right.
And I actually do think that at times can be very powerful. Egyptian people have shown themselves, because I think the weak disciplinary nature of the state, to be rather ungovernable when called upon to be. And this, of course, is not necessarily, again, this can just reform itself in different kind of systems of oppression and violence and stuff as much as it can be an emancipatory characteristic. But it is interesting, the state is the hider of memory, or the keeper of memory, but at the same time it doesn't really exploit that very much. It's not as powerful as, let's say, the nationalist education in the United States, where by fleshing out the detail of it and by presenting a complete image, you actually, I think, instill a great deal more ideology within the kind of the person you're teaching. So how we deal with it as a collective, I think, is, we're dealing on a much shorter term generally. We reference a longer history at times, but I think just the nature of the medium that we're working in doesn't often allow us to kind of like really get into the level of depth, let's say. But you do see it even within the past couple of years. Look at what is mentioned and what's not, what is said and what isn't said in official statements. How, the state has been willing to speak about the revolution, but how have they spoken about the revolution? They have done so, I think, in a way that's, that this was an 18-day thing, that some good-looking kids came out, held up some signs, Mubarak kind of decided to step down out of his own kind of dignity, and also the way that this has been used to kind of geographically restrict it, to say that, that it happened in Tahrir, it happened in this square. you know, I think all of these are attempts to kind of shrink what was really just an all-points kind of political explosion down to where any attempt to kind of replicate it, you know, to where, you know, you see it, or I guess you don't see it now because nobody is allowed to do anything. But, you know, I remember when Sherief was kind of saying that we'll make a Hyde Park. And, you know, or the way that people say, well, if you don't like it, you can go protest, you can go stand, you can hold a sign. I mean, at the point, they are allowing, or, you know, or were, I mean, allowing protest to the extent that that protest was sure not to achieve anything. You know, and they wrote the narrative in such a way that it was supposedly a story of people power, but really it just, you know, avoided all of the kind of real moments of kind of transformation that happened. So, you know, I think that those are relevant questions and things that one tries to deal with. But like, I really do take heart in the fact that they are not terribly effective in their tools. They prefer a blunt instrument to, you know, others, and so, you know, it's just it's an open question. I mean, I don't know when we're ever going to get access to the archives.
Right.
You know, I mean, maybe we have to just kind of go on now, assuming that, you know, that treating that as the formation itself that we're dealing with, as opposed to kind of trying to find the information around it and under it, to actually treat that as something of historical fact in itself.
Yes. Yes. You know, as I listen to you, I am struck by the fact that, you know, we are still in a revolutionary process, if indeed there is a struggle over images with a population which is ungovernable, as you say, and has been mobilized. Can we, you know, the reactions earlier have been, gosh, is this more like 1789 or 1848 or let's say 1987, Eastern Europe? But it strikes me that there is a new thing that you're bringing to this, which is the more systematic organization of memories that may in turn themselves be part of a revolutionary process that continues. That is, you know, the French Revolution went on from what, 1789 to when was it sort of stabilized finally?
1730 was the
96, 7, something like that. A number of years. What were they thinking at that time? They didn't have these sort of memory tools, and life must have been, you know, pretty ordinary much of the time. It strikes me there is a qualitative difference today when, in fact, you have these sort of memory tools to re-enlighten people and get beyond the, well, kind of, I remember the second wave that, you know, the summer of 2011, or when was it, the fall, you know, our revolution is back again, you know, that sort of almost narcissistic kind of attitude. But this goes much beyond that and suggests that maybe there is indeed a sort of new forms of revolutionary process. Are there comparisons we can make with other very contemporary sort of media-driven or media-influenced revolutions?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is interesting. It is interesting to think, you know, about the point at which the comparisons don't work, which isn't to kind of like, let's say, necessarily speak of, oh, the uniqueness of what's happened. I mean, or like the exemplary nature of it in any way. But, and at times I've kind of gone back and forth about wanting to kind of look to historical precedents and to see if there's knowledge to be gleaned there, or at others just to kind of like revel in the just total weirdness of what's going on here and how I don't seem to be able to grasp it through looking at other lenses. I think what's really interesting though is the extent to which, despite the fact that I can go and pull up a video from 2011 at any given time, walking through the streets right now is actually very, very normal. It is far too normal. However, there's one interesting kind of memory tool, which is graffiti. And not necessarily the kind of large murals even, but the kind of graffiti that has made itself everywhere, the kind of really crappy freehand stuff that is not, that in a way one simply filters out. It becomes part of the texture of the wall space. Like, exposed enough to graffiti. I don't see it, necessarily. But at the same time, how this has sort of marked itself, it creates sort of ripples wherein one knows that something was here. Even if I'm not reading it, even if I don't know its content, I think that it registers subconsciously as I'm walking by it as something was happening, something happened here. I marched past it. You can trace protest routes by following the graffiti. You can figure out who protests on this route or who most recently did. You can look at conversations between neighbors, and that's a very primitive, so to speak, tool. It's a technology which has been around for, I forget when the spray can was invented, but even before then you could paint with a brush. But so this is, this is a very interesting question, I think, related to technology as well. If we see this